Oh, I'm gonna struggle to contain myself today, because negative reaction might just be perfect.
You're a gem.
Playing against type, Dick Van Dyke ditches his usual nice guy persona to star as killer photographer Paul Galesko. Years of being henpecked by his nagging fishwife Frances have driven this prominent picture taker to the edge, and today he's decided to finally rid himself and the world of her for good. Antoinette Bauer does a great job with her small role as the ill-fated Frances Galesko. She's a shrew through and through, making her one of the series' very least sympathetic victims.
If this is some sort of a joke, must I remind you that you have no sense of humor, and you never have, none at all. And this is the final proof of it.
Come on, are you telling me if she was your wife, you wouldn't murder her? You'd probably murder her even if she wasn't your wife, you sick fuck. God, what kind of weirdos watch my channel? And yet it's hard not to feel a stab of sympathy for the old crow in her final moments, as she realizes what's about to happen to her. And despite her attempts to put on a brave face, the look in her eyes betrays her true feelings of fear and terror. Bravo to Bauer. Though, does it bother anyone else that there's absolutely no kickback from the gun firing? In direct contrast to Frances Galesko, we have Alvin Deschler, one of the series' most sympathetic victims. He's an ex-con only recently just out of prison, hoping to get his life back together. Galesko appears to be helping him get back on his feet, but in reality he's manipulating him into being an accomplice to his own murder.
Somebody's got your wife.
You have any idea who took her?
I'm sorry, Al. It's gonna have to look like you did.
What's up with the way Dick Van Dyke looks at the guns after he's fired them? He's like, wow, I didn't know it could really do that. Deschler's played quite likably by Don Gordon, a good friend of Steve McQueen who often appeared in films with him, such as The Towering Inferno, released the same year as this episode. Columbo's intro is hilarious as always, with this cop mistaking him for someone trying to drop their car off at the junkyard. I love this cop, by the way, brimming with attitude. Fair play to this extra for making the best out of such a small role.
I just leave it here. I think it'll be all right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
Actually, speaking of, one of Negative Reaction's biggest strengths is its stellar supporting cast of cracking characters, all portrayed with conviction by consummate character actors at the peak of their game. The three standouts that the episode is best known for are the bum, the nun, and the driving instructor. The bum is an old tramp who happened to be residing in the junkyard where the murder took place. That's right, he overheard the entire conversation between Galesko and Deschler. That'd have old Paul banged to rights. If the scruffy old fart wasn't so drunk, he can't remember a single word that was said. This wino, aka Thomas Dolan, is another turn by series regular Vito Scotti in what is probably his best role. He's intelligent, witty, eloquent when not shit-faced.
But I gotta say this stuff is not bad. What is this, beef stew?
That is the prevailing theory.
Much like Columbo himself, the man beneath the rags is a far cry from what you'd assume him to be at first glance. On the topic of first glances, we gotta talk about the nun. See, when Columbo goes to talk to Mr. Dolan at the homeless mission, he's greeted by a delightfully daffy nun who thinks he's a bum himself.
Oh, that coat. The coat, that coat, that coat.
Something vaguely similar actually happened to me once, but that's another story for another day. Anyway, the Sister of Mercy here is played by Joyce Van Patten, who we'll see again in a future Columbo episode.
I'll be back.
I'll probably be in my mid-60s by the time I get around to reviewing it, though.
Oh, you poor man.
Then there's the driving instructor, Mr. Weekly, played by Larry Storch, a famous comedian at the time, but I always remember him as the first guy to ever voice the Joker in a Batman cartoon.
So the dynamic duo has finally arrived to call on the Joker. Do drop in, gentlemen.
Columbo has to interview him because he oversaw Alvin Deschler's driving test. His sworn witness statement will prove that Deschler could not have kidnapped Frances as he was taking the test at the time the abduction supposedly took place. When Columbo finds Mr. Weekly, he's, how shall we say,
Irritable.
Columbo gives him a ride to lunch, and the uptight driving instructor, paired with the LAPD's most reckless motorist, is a mismatch made in comedy heaven. The man's growing frustration, not to mention fear, with Columbo's blatant disregard for the rules of the road, is priceless.
Look behind you, Lieutenant. Watch your right. Always watch that right. Keep your eyes on the road, Lieutenant.
I'm all right,
eyes
sir.
on
I'm
the
all right.
road. Just pull over.
This is what Columbo as a show does so well. It takes the bit parts that could have been, well, nothing really, and makes them into something. The beautiful combination of superb writing and bang-on casting makes the world feel lived in, makes the characters feel like real people, and honestly, any of these zany characters would have been more than deserving of their very own spin-off show. Are you telling me you wouldn't watch a sitcom set at the homeless shelter where Thomas Dolan bursts in every episode telling tales of bizarre situations he's witnessed, while the bird-brained nun just nods along and says, "That's nice, Thomas"? Or how about a show where the driving instructor gets into a different adventure with a different student every week? Call it the Weekly Show. But while everyone remembers and always talks about the nun, the bum, and the overly glum, we can't forget about all the other side characters which makes this supporting cast so rich. How about the guy in the camera shop that Columbo has a friendly interaction with? Or the cordial police captain played by Bill Zuckert that Columbo chats to in the evidence lockup?
Columbo! Hey, what are you doing down here in the dungeon?
And did you spot Beverly Hills Cop and Midnight Run star John Ashton in an early role as a real estate guy?
Fucking A, I'm the best.
Yes, you are, John Ashton. Yes, you are. I'm also a fan of Sergeant Hoffman, played by Michael Strong. Unlike some of Columbo's previous partners, he's very competent, even though he falls for the story Gillespie wants the police to believe, but that's more of a credit to Paul's ingenious scheming than a black mark against Hoffman.
Everybody makes mistakes.
And although he disagrees with Columbo that there's more to this case than meets the eye, he never seems to lose respect for the lieutenant. He's just a really solid ally, a good cop doing good, honest work, and that's honestly refreshing to see from a character who isn't Columbo. Reminds us that the LAPD isn't totally overrun by buffoons. Like many other characters in Negative Reaction, I would have welcomed a reappearance by Sergeant Hoffman in another adventure.
Released in San Quentin 3 weeks ago after serving 5 years on an extortion conviction. Well, now you've really got him, Lieutenant.
Between all the praise I'm lavishing on the supporting cast, I can't forget to lavish the most on our guest star. Dick Van Dyke must be lauded for his portrayal of Paul Gillespie. I'm always a fan of casting against type. Well, usually. And Van Dyke's casting was one of the very best examples. Best known as the lovable chimney sweep Bert in the immortal Disney classic Mary Poppins, and a familiar face on television thanks to his sitcom roles, Van Dyke was certainly an unusual choice at the time to play a Columbo villain, especially one so sneering and lacking any redeeming qualities. But Van Dyke had recently proved his worth as a dramatic actor in an Emmy-nominated made-for-TV movie called The Morning After. In it, he plays an alcoholic, and Van Dyke was able to draw on the fact that in real life, he too was an actual alcoholic, only recently in recovery.
I had to offer you something, Lieutenant, but I'm not a drinker.
This was the role that put him on the radar of Columbo producer Everett Chambers. The result of his casting is an absolute triumph, giving us not only one of the most memorably unpleasant killers of the series, but one of the most enjoyable Columbo and killer dynamics as well. Falk and Van Dyke sparkle in every scene they share together, each man bringing out the best in the other. There's something deeply unlikable about Paul Gillespie that makes you root so strongly for Columbo to topple him.
Columbo, you're becoming very annoying. Do you know that?
And yet, he's compelling at the same time. As I said already, you do understand why he wants rid of his domineering wife, so you can almost feel empathy for his motivation in a way. Plus, he wants to plug his secretary, Lorna McGrath, played by Joanna Cameron, which is definitely a very relatable motivation.
Very competent young lady. Very professional.
Still, overall, he's a proper nasty bastard in this.
And her buying that new dress and all.
Mrs. Moylan, please. My wife's whereabouts are none of your concern. Is that clear?
I guess you could say he's a bit of a dick.
It was unnecessary.
But it's not just the fantastic acting across the board that makes this episode a classic, as the wonderful cast is bolstered by an absolutely superb script. The sole writing credit for this episode goes to Peter S. Fisher, who joined the series last season with publisher Parrish and followed it up with A Friend Indeed. Those episodes were both stellar, save for maybe Publish's final clue, but here he's managed to outdo himself. Paul's perilous plot to off his wife and frame an unwise ex-con is one of the most well thought out of the entire series. I especially love how there are so many moving parts involved. It makes it so much fun to watch Gillespie set it all up at the start of the episode. It's completely understandable why the police at large wouldn't think to look beyond the obvious with this case, as it really does seem pretty open and shut, making Columbo look all the more impressive when he pegs that there are a few holes in Gillespie's story. Actually, the first clue is a hole in Gillespie's trouser leg. If he and Deschler shot each other at basically the exact same moment, how did burn marks from Deschler's gun get onto Gillespie's trousers? The subsequent trail of clues that Columbo unravels across the remaining runtime are simply joyful. I love clues in Columbo, and the more there are, the happier I am. And there are a fuck ton of clues in Negative Reaction. But again, none of them serve to undermine Gillespie as an antagonist. It's not like how, say, Emmett Clayton makes a lot of really obvious mistakes that make him look more like a moron than a competent threat. I won't even have time to list all of them, but here, let's take a look at the mounting evidence. The aforementioned hole in the trousers. The fact that Gillespie was late to the ransom drop.
Well, it's hard for me to understand, sir, because if it was my wife and the man who had taken her said to be there at 5 o'clock, I'd be damn certain that I got there on time. I certainly wouldn't want to keep him waiting.
Gillespie saying he never met Deschler, even though he published an entire book of photographs taken at the very prison where Deschler was an inmate for several years.
You see that man in the background?
Yes?
That's Mr. Deschler.
Why did the kidnapper bother to take 2 photos of Francis? Could it be because Gillespie was a perfectionist when it comes to his art form and wanted to use the best possible photo he could take in a way that would never have even occurred to Alvin?
Otherwise, why would he take another one?
Now, even classics like Murder by the Book tend to falter right at the last hurdle, producing an unmemorable and unsatisfying gotcha. But not Negative Reaction. Oh no, because Columbo and Gillespie's final showdown is one for the history books. Columbo lures Gillespie down to police HQ and presents him with a blown up photograph of Frances, in which the clock behind her seems to place the time of the kidnapping at 10 in the morning, a time that Gillespie previously claimed he was at home alone with his wife. Gillespie gets riled up as he tries to explain that Columbo has simply reversed the photo and the clock actually reads 2 in the afternoon, but Columbo reveals that he accidentally destroyed the original photo by dropping it in some acid in the photo lab, meaning that there is no proof that the clock reads 2 p.m.
What?
This gets Paul's dander up so much that he grabs the camera right off the shelf, the very same camera used to take the photo in the first place.
You just incriminated yourself, sir. You've identified the camera.
Now, is that a gotcha, or is that a gotcha? Much has been made of the enigmatic final shot of the episode, where Columbo slumps silently on his desk as the credits roll. Some read this as Columbo simply being exhausted after the closing of a particularly tough case. Others think that this is a slump of sadness as he looks at the photo of the late Francis Gillespie, and is reminded of the senseless waste of human life this case has wrought. But some, such as the Columbo file, interpret this as Columbo being introspective, borderline ashamed of his own actions. He had to cross an ethical line in order to get Gillespie to slip up, knowingly reversing the photo and then pretending to have lost the original. Personally, this interpretation of the scene never even occurred to me until I read the Columbo Files review. Until then, I guess I'd always just assumed that Columbo was tired. But yeah, there's definitely something there, and I've read other reviews and forum posts which seem to support a growing consensus that Columbo views this as a Pyrrhic victory of sorts. Hell, he even apologizes to Gillespie for catching him out.
Sorry, sir.
I should probably comment on this too. Much was made by me of the awful ending to Mind Over Mayhem, which also involved a frame-up job to finally catch the killer. The gotcha from Negative Reaction works a lot better for me for a couple reasons. One, it's more akin to Death Lends a Hand's ending, where Columbo blurs the ethical lines to invoke an incriminating reaction, rather than outright strong-arm a confession. Two, he at least seems like he's bothered by it, whereas in Mind Over Mayhem, he just shrugs it off. And three, Negative Reaction is just a better bloody episode by a country mile, so fuck off. So yeah, I adore Negative Reaction. Part of the reason this season of reviews took so long to come out was that I wanted to make absolutely sure that I had said everything that I wanted to say about this one, and even then I'm not sure I covered it all.
Well, you failed miserably.
Also, like every other Columbo fan, I was busy watching Poker Face. This has everything I want in a Columbo adventure, and I would go so far as to say that this is the ideal episode to introduce someone to the show. So if you want to get a friend hooked on your favorite detective series, look no further than Negative Reaction.